Okay, so we've covered a lot of background to get to the point that we're at now, which is the point where we're ready to start editing. And you know what? I know that it may have seemed long, but I think it's important that you understand everything that we've covered up until this point before you start throwing clips into your timeline. That way you're going to know where you need to go to find things if you start to run into trouble, or if you just need to find things to do in your day-to-day editing needs. Okay, but let's talk about a couple things before we drop our first clip into our timeline. In most cases, when we launch Final Cut Pro, we're brought to a screen that looks like this. We see our project window, we see our viewer, we see our canvas, and we see our timeline. And in most cases, what's going to happen is that when you launch Final Cut Pro, it's going to drop a new sequence into your project so that you're ready to edit with it. But there's only one problem. We really don't know what's going on with this sequence because remember, we want to have our sequence settings based on the clips that we're using. That way we know everything will play back in real time. The sequence that's created when you launch Final Cut Pro is a sequence that conforms to whatever your current easy setup is set to. And how you can find that out quickly and easily is simply to come over to the Final Cut Pro drop-down menu and come down to Easy Setup. And once you click on it, it will tell you that this sequence is HD, it's 2398, and it's an HDV 720p24. Now the footage that we're going to be working with is not HDV 720p24, but that's okay because we're going to get to something else in just a second that's important that you keep in mind. So first thing that you're normally going to do when you launch a new project is you're going to come in and you're going to create an easy setup based on what you want to use. So we're going to set it to be 2997 and we're going to set it to be HDV 1080i 60. And I'm going to say setup. Now, as soon as you say that, it doesn't really look like anything's happened, but it has. Final Cut Pro is now switched over so that all of the settings for your sequence and any capture or output is set to go for HDV 1080i 60. So if I come up to File and I say New and I say Sequence, or remember the shortcut is Command and N, as in Nancy, it's going to create a new sequence and we can just call it HDV 1080i 60. Now, like I said, I kept the other sequence there for a reason, and you'll notice that down here I have sequence 1 up as my timeline, my current timeline. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come back here, and we're just going to call this HDV 720p24. As soon as I press enter, you'll notice that down here the tab is now changed to say HDV 720p24. Now what I want to do is I want to get in and show you how we can see what is going on with these timelines. Now I'm going to use the HDV 720p24 timeline only because I happen to have it up in my window. So what I'm going to do is with the timeline selected, I'm going to press Command and 0 on my keyboard. And you'll see that as soon as I do, I am now greeted with the sequence settings. And the sequence settings are going to tell us everything that we need to know about this sequence that we're working with. For example, the first thing is the frame size. It's 1280 by 720, and you can see that it says right here HDTV 720p 16 by 9. The pixel aspect ratio is square. There is no field dominance because remember we're dealing with a progressive image, and in this case it's 24 true progressive frames, and you can see that our editing time base is set to 23.98, and you can see one of the most important things is that our QuickTime video settings is set to be HDV 720p24. If you look over to the right of your QuickTime video settings, you'll also notice that your audio settings are set to 48 kilohertz for the audio rate, it's 16-bit depth, and the configuration is set to channel grouped. Now in most cases, because you're going to be working with easy setups, you're really not going to need to change anything in your general sequence settings tab. Where you're going to need to get in and change stuff is in your actual timeline options. So let's come over to timeline options for a second. And you can see right at the top, most importantly, is the starting time code of your timeline. Now I have mine set to be at 59 minutes, and the reason that is because many of the projects that I work on require me to put in bars and tone, a slate, a countdown leader, and then the piece. So therefore I need about a minute to put all of that information in. Obviously color bars and tone are used as a reference so that when you take your tape and you send it to the broadcaster, they'll have a point of reference to calibrate their machines so that what you edited and what they're broadcasting looks exactly the same. A slate is a generated graphic that you're going to use to give information to the broadcaster about your show. So for example, you would have on it your show name, you'd have the duration, you would have your name, you'd have the editor's name, and you probably would have the date that it's edited. All slates vary slightly, but it's important to have a lot of information, especially the running time on that, so that the broadcaster can make sure that what you've sent them and what they've asked for are exactly the same. Now next, you can come down and you see that we have track size, and our track size is set to small. Track size obviously references the size of our tracks down here. And if you come up here, you'll see that I can switch from small to medium to large and even to reduced. I'll just switch to reduced here and you'll see what happens. You'll see that it shrinks down. Now, one thing I do want to point out is, like I always say, there's always a bunch of ways to do things in Final Cut Pro, and I'm just going to switch back to small for a second here. And you can change this somewhere else. You don't need to come into sequence settings to change this all the time. I'm just going to hit cancel for a sec, and you'll see that if I come down to the bottom of my timeline right here, I have 4 icons. And you'll see that I can toggle my timeline track height to be extra large, large, what I had it as regular, or reduced. And now I'm just going to set this back to be normal, and I'm going to get back into my sequence settings by pressing Command and 0 on my keyboard. And I'm going to come back to the timeline options. Now we do have a couple other options down here. You'll see next in our breakdown we have thumbnail display, and right now it's set to be name. You'll see we also have the option of name plus thumbnail and film strip. I'm going to come back to this in just a second because we're going to need to import some clips into our timeline so that I can show you what the thumbnail display actually is. So why don't we do that right now? Let's import something into our project. So I'm just going to press cancel. We're going to come over to our project window, and to import these clips, I'm simply going to press Command and I on my keyboard. We're going to navigate to our project files, FCP7, and we're in Chapter 4. And it's the Harlem Wizards. Now there's a couple ways, of course, that we can bring this in. I can simply double click on Harlem Wizards and I can select the first clip. I can press Command and A to select them all, and then I can say choose. The only problem with this is that it becomes a bit of an organizational mess because then I have to reorganize stuff the way that it is on my hard drive, which I don't want to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to say cancel, and instead of pressing Command I, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click in my project window and I'm going to say import, and I'm going to come over to folder. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate back to that Wizards folder, Chapter 4. I'm going to select Harlem Wizards, and now I'm going to say choose, and it's going to import that folder exactly the way that it was on my hard drive. In the case of organization for this folder, there's nothing really that complicated because you'll see everything is located in one folder. But if this folder had a lot of subfolders in it, it would import it into Final Cut with that hierarchy exactly the way that it is on my hard drive, which is a very simple and easy way to keep yourself organized. Okay, so let's just take a clip and we're going to drop it into our timeline. So I'll just take the first one. And remember, we talked about the easiest way to take a clip and drop it into your timeline. We're simply going to drag it and drop it. And as soon as we let it go, you see that we get a very peculiar warning, and it says, for best performance, your sequence and external video should be set to the format of the clips you're editing. Change sequence settings to match the clip settings. Final Cut Pro is able to edit in what is called a multi-format timeline, and what that means is that you can take any resolution, any frame rate, and work with it in any type of timeline in Final Cut Pro. That's great in theory, but it's also something that you're going to need to keep in mind because anytime you take a clip that doesn't match the timeline settings and you drop it into your sequence, you're going to have to render it. We're going to get to rendering in a little bit, but for right now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say no. And you'll see that when the clip gets dropped in, I now have the clip and a green bar over top of it. Why is that? Well, because if we come up to our clip and we right click and we come down to Item Properties and we say Format, you'll see that this clip is HDV 1080i60 and my timeline is HDV 720p 24. Now we know that I have a timeline that is HDV 1080i60, so why don't we use that timeline so we don't have any problems? So I'm simply going to come back and say cancel. I'm going to select the clip by simply just grabbing and dragging around it, or you can just simply click on it to select it, and I'm going to press the delete key. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to come up and we're just going to close our folder here, and I'm just going to double click on HDV 1080i60. You'll see now that that is the active sequence because the tab is highlighted in my sequences window. And I'm going to come back up to my Harlem Wizards folder, and I'm just going to take that same clip and we're going to drag it and we're going to drop it into our timeline, and watch what happens now. Nothing, because our clip matches our sequence. Okay, so let's get back into our sequence settings. Let's come back to the beginning here. And you'll see that this starts at 59 minutes, but I'm going to have this start at the 1 hour mark. So let's press Command and 0 to get back into our sequence settings. And we're going to come over to our timeline options again. For the sequence that we're working on, we're going to set it to be non-drop frame. So I'm just going to turn off the checkbox beside drop frame. And what we're going to do is we're going to put the starting time code as 1 hour. I'm going to leave the track size as small, And now let's talk about our thumbnail display. What is our thumbnail display? Well, the thumbnail display is what you see as the description down here on my actual clip. So you'll see right now my clip is called Two Guys Synchro Juggling. Why? Well, because that is what my clip is called up in my project window. We'll just come back up here. There it is. Two Guys Synchro Juggling. Let's get back into our sequence settings by pressing, yep, you guessed it, Command and 0. And we're going to come back to timeline options. And we're going to set this to be, again, 1 hour. So we're going to set it to be 01000000. Track size is small now. You'll see that the next one, like I said, is thumbnail display. Right now it is set to name, and so what it's doing is it's displaying the name of the clip. But we have some other options in here. So let's click on name, and you'll see that we now have something called name plus thumbnail. Well, I wonder what that is. Well, let's click on it and find out. Oh, well, you'll see what's happened now is that a little image has appeared on my clip. And what's interesting about that image, and I'm just going to come over here and I'm going to say OK to leave all of my settings the way they are. And you'll notice that as soon as I do, if I come back to the beginning of my timeline, it's now at the 1 hour mark. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to increase the track size so that we can see the thumbnail a little bit better. And you'll notice, if we scroll up a bit, that the first frame of the clip that's in my timeline now is what is being displayed in this thumbnail. So this is a way that you can have a visual representation of what is going on in your timeline and what the very first frame of that clip is. You'll see now that if I press Command and 0 to go back into my sequence settings, and I come back to timeline options, you'll see that I have another option called film strip, and watch what happens when I select film strip. We now have a visual representation almost like a film strip that shows frames from that clip in my timeline. I'm just going to come back and I'm just going to set it back to be the normal size, because you'll see depending on the size of your clips will determine how many film strip frames it shows you. Now for me, I don't personally like to work this way, but the best part about Final Cut Pro is you can work however you want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Command and 0 to go back into my timeline options, and I'm just going to turn that back to name. Now, our audio track labels, we want to leave as A1, A2, A3, and A4. You'll see that we have A1 and A2 right here. It's just easier to keep things organized like that. The other option that you have is looking at things as stereo pairs, where they'll be labeled as A1A and A1B, meaning stereo left and stereo right, A2A, A2B, stereo left, stereo right. But for me, that just gets a little bit confusing. I like to leave it as sequential, A1, A2, A3, and A4. Now, a couple other things I want to talk about before we're done talking about our sequence settings is I want to talk about some track display options. Now, we're going to talk about a couple of these a little bit later on when we start dealing with effects, but for right now, the couple that I want to show you is a big one, and it's one that a lot of editors like to work with. I don't personally like to work with it, but a lot of editors do, and that is show audio waveforms. What is an audio waveform? An audio waveform is a visual representation of the audio in your timeline. So if I turn that on, you'll immediately notice that in my timeline, we now have a bar that has appeared, and you can see, if you look very closely, we can see some audio waveforms. An easier clip to see that with is the Harlem Wizards theme. If I take that, and I drag it into my timeline, and I drop it, you'll see now I have a visual representation of what this sound looks like. You'll also notice that as I drag, it has to update, which can be a little bit annoying depending on how you like to work. That's why in most cases, I'll only turn this on if I'm editing audio. So I'm going to press Command 0 to go back to my sequence settings. We'll go back to our timeline options tab. I'm just going to turn off the audio waveform for right now. And I'm going to show you one now that I use on a constant basis, and that is show duplicate frames. What that does is that it's going to give you a bar across any clips in your timeline that are duplicated somewhere else. And let me show you what I mean. I'm going to say OK, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete this clip of audio by simply selecting it and pressing delete. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take that first clip, the two guys synchro juggling, and I'm going to edit it into my timeline again by simply grabbing it and dragging it and dropping it in there. Watch what happens. You'll see now that I have a red bar that appears throughout my clip. And if I zoom back on my timeline by pressing Command and minus, you'll see now that I know that these two clips are identical to each other because there's a red bar underneath them. What's great about this is that if I have multiple clips that are duplicates of a single clip, what's going to happen is every time two guys synchro juggling appears in my timeline and it's been used before, it will be a red bar. If, for example, I'm using 3B ball juggling .move-1, it might be a blue bar or it might be a green bar. So you can see that it's very easy to keep track of what's going on because they give you different colors to reference clips by. This is one, like I said, that I like to leave on all the time because in many cases, I don't want to be duplicating clips that appear in my timeline because people are smart and they'll see that right away. Okay, so I'm just going to press Command and 0 to go back into my sequence settings. I'll come back to timeline options. And like I said, we're going to get into a couple of these other options when we deal with effects. But for right now, I'm happy with how my timeline's set up, so I'm simply going to press OK. And now let's get back and just talk a little bit more about multi-format sequences.